Hi everyone, I'm going to get started. I hope everyone is doing well today, and if you're watching live, happy Friday. I hope you're ready for a well-deserved rest this weekend. I'm Katie Jacobs from the CIPD. I've been chairing our coronavirus webinar series, and this afternoon we are returning once again, and maybe for the last time, to the topic of furlough. Specifically, we're going to be taking you through and taking your questions on the next iteration of the furlough scheme, also known as the flexible furlough scheme. So joining us to discuss this today and to answer your questions, we've got Ben Wilmot, Head of Public Policy at the CIPD, Andrew Willis, Head of Legal and Advisory at HR Inform, which is the CIPD's employment law resource, and Alistair Swindlehurst, owner of Swindlehurst Consulting. Thank you all very much for joining us today. As ever, I'm just going to run through some very quick housekeeping. A reminder that this session is being recorded. It will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website, hopefully this afternoon, if not early next week. And you can also access recordings of our previous webinars there, as well as sign up for all our future sessions. Taking questions. Please do submit questions during the webinar, and you can submit them anytime during the discussion. Could I ask you to use the Q&A tab, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat box questions. A reminder that for legal advice, CIPD members can call our HR Inform helpline. It's available 24/7, and if you use that, you get an individual response. And a reminder that we're updating the FAQs and resources on our website all the time as new information becomes available. So head to the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for more. And finally, as ever, I want to flag our wellbeing service for members in the UK and Ireland. With award-winning workplace wellbeing provider Health Assured, we're now able to provide CIPD members with free help and support via sessions with qualified therapists. So it's a tool that we hope you don't need to access, but it is there if you need it. So on to furlough. So we did a webinar about this, time is meaningless, but a few weeks ago now, and I think I said in my introduction that 8.4 million people were currently on furlough, and that was more than a quarter of the UK's workforce. Now, since then, a further 500,000 people have joined them. So from the 9th of June, 8.9 million people were covered by the government's coronavirus job retention scheme. And that's even before the 10th of June deadline for adding new people to the scheme. Now, from July, changes to the government's coronavirus job retention scheme will enable companies who have furloughed workers to bring them back in on a more flexible basis and allow for part-time working. New guidance was released last Friday, and if you are all watching out for it, like I know our panel were, then you will have seen it was released very late on Friday, just in time for a lovely weekend work. So today we're going to go through the new guidance, which explains how the changes to the scheme are going to work in practice. We're going to hear from our panel, who will take you through the points you need to know, and then we'll take your questions. We had quite a lot of questions submitted in advance, so I'm going to try and cover those as well. But for now, I'm going to put myself on mute and hand over to Ben, who's going to give an opening update. Thank you, Ben. And a reminder that, Ben, you need to unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, as Katie says, yeah, we now have more than 1 in 4 employees on furlough, and total claims under the scheme now amount to just over £20 billion, just highlighting how massive this scheme is and the intervention by government to keep people in employment. Looking ahead, we now have clarity on the future direction of the scheme and how the government is going to gradually unwind its level of wage subsidy over the summer before the scheme finishes at the end of October. And it's also announced that from 1st of July, we are going to see flexible furlough being introduced. So, and this is a key change that the CIPD has lobbied government for. So we're extremely pleased to see that, but of course that does bring greater complexity to the scheme. And in the last week, the government has updated its guidance, particularly on this issue around how employers can claim for staff who are being furloughed flexibly and are starting to come back to work on reduced hours. Now I'll just provide a quick top-line summary of the key changes before Andrew and Alistair provide more detail on the implications of these changes from a legal and from a people management practice perspective. So in June this month, the final date by which an employer could furlough an employee for the first time has passed. That was 10th of June. The scheme officially closes for new entrants on 30th of June. As I said before, the key change in July is that from 1st July, employers can bring furloughed staff back to work gradually on reduced hours. In August, the government starts to gradually reduce its level of financial support. The level of wage subsidy stays at 80%, but employers have to start paying national insurance, pension and pension contributions. In September, the government reduces its level of wage subsidy to 70%, and then that reduces further to 60% in October. Next slide, please. So the key change around flexible furlough is, of course, extremely welcome, but it does require employers to think carefully about how they do this. And so just some sort of top-line considerations. Certainly employers should be seeking to involve employees and or union representatives in the process. They should be seeking to agreement over flexible working hours or patterns. They should be focusing very carefully around making sure that flexible furlough is done fairly, avoiding any form of discrimination, making sure relevant employees, that employees are informed that they are on flexible furlough and that there's a clear written record that confirms this. And then clarity around the length of the claim period, what to include when calculating wages and employees' usual hours and furloughed hours. And I mean, Alistair and Andrew will be going into that in some detail. And crucially, planning for what will happen when the furlough scheme ends on at the end of October. And so really having that sort of longer term perspective, as well as getting to grips with the detail. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to take any questions on any aspect of public policy on skills and employment in the Q&A.
Thank you very much for that overview, Ben. I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Andrew's going to give us a legal update about the new guidance. So over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So picking up with the first slide, confirmation then that the furlough scheme will now run until the end of October. And as Ben's already touched on, the government will continue to reimburse 80% of furloughed workers' normal wage costs until the end of July, and from then on, employer contributions to that must begin. Firstly, with a contribution to cover the cost of all national insurance contributions and pension contributions, but then from August on, contribution to the actual salary as well. The important thing to note here is that employees will not see a difference in the amount that they will receive if they're furloughed, so that they will continue to be entitled to receive a minimum of 80% of their normal salary. And that's subject to their agreement, obviously, as well. You still need to secure their agreement to that reduction in the normal, but they won't see a difference. The difference will be in the way that's funded, and employers will start to fund that from the 1st of August. As Ben's also said, the really big advantage of this now is that you can start to bring people back on a part-time basis and have them start to pick up work again. Previously, of course, furloughed employees had to be furloughed for a minimum of 3 weeks and could not do any work at all during that period. Now you can start to bring them back and have them build up the amount of hours that they do. Ben mentioned the deadline for furloughing employees for the first time onto the scheme. So the deadline was the 10th of June for the first period of furlough to commence. There are a couple of exceptions to that, though. One is employees returning from family leave, that's paternity leave or maternity leave and other types of leave, or military reservists returning from service. Now, I'll break that last but one bullet point down a little bit, because I've mentioned there other staff previously furloughed. What I mean there is that an organisation can place people returning from family leave or from military service onto furlough for the first time after the 10th of June, provided they have previously furloughed other staff, obviously before the 10th of June. So that's what that bullet point's getting at. You must have furloughed other people, but if you have, you can actually furlough people in those two categories later than you would otherwise have been able to. The other important point to mention is those who have previously been furloughed but then brought back to work. So, of course, that 10th of June deadline applied to those being furloughed for the first time. You may, though, have furloughed somebody back in April or May and then brought them back to work. Those people can be re-furloughed either before the 1st of July, in which case they'll go on to old style furlough, or on or after the 1st of July, in which case they'll be flexibly furloughed and you'll have maximum flexibility there. The important thing to say about that is that those people that are brought back in this little window between the 11th of June and the 30th of June, because they've previously been furloughed, they must complete 3 weeks of old style furlough. The new period of furlough must be a minimum 3 weeks before they can move on to flexible furlough. So, for example, somebody being furloughed for the first time today, you won't be able to place them on flexible furlough until the first week of July is passed. So that's just a little gap there between old and new style furlough that affects those who have previously been furloughed and then brought back to work. Next slide, please. Okay, so this just confirms the tapering nature of the scheme that Ben's already touched on. One important thing to add there is about caps. So as you can see, the cap on the contribution from the furlough scheme starts to drop from 1st September and into 1st October. That's the maximum the government will pay. The overall cap, of course, is still 80% or £2,500, but that will be prorated to reflect the number of furloughed hours as against working hours. So to give a simple example, if in August, one of your employees works for 2 days out of their normal 5-day week and is furloughed for 3, then the monthly cap drops down from 2,500 to 1,500 on a pro rata basis. So they will be paid as normal for the 2 days that they work in accordance with their contract of employment. You can reclaim reimbursement of salary under the scheme for the 3 days that they don't work, but up to a maximum of £1,500 per month. Next slide, please. Just a slide here on agreement. As has always been very, very important, you must secure your employee's agreement to being furloughed, because it is a variation to the contract of employment. Of course, that's especially so if you're also asking them to take a reduction in salary. Some employers have been able to top up pay to 100%, but many more haven't. So, of course, you also need agreement to that as well. When it comes to flexible furlough, a new agreement will certainly be needed because, of course, previously, any agreement would have prohibited employees from carrying out any work at all during their furlough period, whereas the whole point of flexible furlough is that they will probably agree to work some hours or some days during the week and then be furloughed for the remainder. The government requires employers to keep a written record of these agreements for 5 years. Now, they don't need to be written agreements with an offer from the employer and a written acceptance from the employee, but there must be an agreement and it must be evidenced in writing. And in the usual way, you would just write to your employees and confirm the nature of the agreement that you reach with them. And as I say, that written record needs to be kept for 5 years. The agreement should permit the employer to work during furlough and set out the circumstances in which you would require that. Now, in some cases, you will have a clear working pattern in mind. Perhaps somebody will be required to work Monday and Tuesday each week, and then be furloughed Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. In other cases, though, you'll need more flexibility than that. You'll want to reserve the right to vary hours, perhaps week to week. So make sure that your overarching agreement with the employee allows for that. I think it's fine to say, with effect from whatever date it is, we'll be requiring you to work so many hours a week. We anticipate it will follow this kind of pattern, but we'll be informing you on a weekly basis as to exactly which hours you'll be required to work. I think that's fine. But to the extent that you do agree with them, do record that in writing and do keep that agreement. What you also need to do is keep records of how many hours your employees actually work and the number of hours they are furloughed. Now, I've read somewhere that you have to keep those records for 6 years. I haven't found that in the guidance, that requirement. It may well be there, but in any event, I would say that's good advice anyway. The limitation period for contract claims is 6 years. So you'd be well advised to keep records of any pay arrangements for 6 years, just so that you're in a position to defend yourself if ever you need to. So definitely advisable to keep the records for 6 years. And as I say, I believe the guidance actually says that's a requirement. Next slide, please. Quick slide on calculating working hours. Because of course what you're required to do is compare working hours against furloughed hours each week and in respect of each claim, and then claim on a pro rata basis. So you'll need to be able to work out what your employees' usual hours are, record the actual hours they work, and also their furloughed hours. Now, the situation is fairly straightforward where employees' working hours are fixed, or where they may work hours sometimes a bit longer than their contractual hours, but their pay doesn't change. In either case, they're treated as being employees with fixed working hours, and the reference period you would use for calculating their normal hours would be the hours they were contracted for at the end of the last pay period ending on or before the 19th of March. In other words, their last normal, in inverted commas, pay period. Just go back to that. That's what their normal hours look like, and then you can compare what you're doing now with that. Where the employee works variable hours, you then need to do a bit more of a complex calculation. You either look at the average number of hours that they worked in the tax year 2019 to 2020, and then divide for a typical pay period, or you would look at the corresponding calendar period in the last tax year, and you would then take the higher of those two. That will give you normal hours to set your new arrangement against. So a bit more of a complicated calculation in the case of those working variable hours, but just gives you the opportunity to compare with the normal, what you're doing now, and then claim accordingly. And then finally, we've got a couple of slides on the claim process and claim periods. So firstly, there's a new rule around claims. When claiming for employees who are flexibly furloughed, you shouldn't be claiming until you're sure of exactly how many hours your employees have worked during the claim period. Now, that's fairly straightforward if you've agreed a fixed ongoing arrangement with employees, but in some cases, as we've said, you'll need to be more flexible than that. You can't submit a claim until you know how many hours employees have worked during the period in question. And clearly this presents difficulties for those who have had to try and submit claims in advance of payday, because you won't be able to do that now unless you can be absolutely certain as to what hours somebody is going to be required to work. Something about numbers of employees as well. Employers can furlough different groups and numbers of employees at different times, but you can only make one claim during a claim period for each PAYE scheme. So make sure all of your furloughed employees are on the one claim, otherwise you'll miss your chance to claim for them. Another one that will be of interest to those of you who have been rotating employees, the number of employees claimed for in any claim period going forward cannot exceed the number claimed for in any one claim ending on or before the 30th of June. So for example, to give a very simple illustration, if you've had 90 employees and you've been rotating them 30 employees furloughed at a time, so that only 30 employees were ever on one of your claims prior to the 30th of June, if you wanted to flexibly furlough all 90 now, you'd have a problem because you wouldn't better claim for those 90 employees, having only ever claimed before for a maximum of 30. It probably won't arise in many cases, but where people have been rotating extensively, that may create an issue. The number claimed for on a claim now cannot exceed the number claimed for on any claim prior to the 30th of June. So that's one to be aware of if you have been rotating. And then final slide, a little bit about claim periods. There's been a lot of talk about this 7-day period mentioned in the new guidance, and some people have taken that to be a minimum furlough period. In actual fact, there's no minimum furlough period under flexible furlough. The only minimum period specified relates to claims. So under old style furlough, you had to furlough for a minimum of 3 weeks. There's no minimum furlough period under flexible furlough, but your claim period must be at least 7 days. So first full week in July, suppose you have somebody furloughed for 2 days as a one-off, somebody furloughed for 2 days as part of an ongoing arrangement, and then a third person still on old style furlough and permanently or semi-permanently off work. You must claim for all 3 of those people on the one claim, and that claim period must cover 7 days as a minimum. In terms of claiming for those on the old style scheme, you can claim until the 31st of July for those furloughed in the period up to the 30th of June. So that's an important deadline to remember. And then you can start to make new claims in relation to flexible furlough from the 1st of July. As well as minimum claim periods, which I've mentioned, you should also be aware that you can no longer overlap months when making claims. So you can't claim for part of July and part of August, for example, in one claim. The reason is that the rules around what you can reclaim will change month to month now. So your first claim period under the new scheme has to end on the 31st of July, and you'll start a new claim period on the 1st of August. However long your claim period is from there, that is an important cut-off to remember. And Katie, they're the main points I wanted to cover for now, and obviously we'll pick up other things with questions, no doubt.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for clarifying that difference between claim periods and furlough periods for the 7 days, because I've seen there's quite a lot of questions that come up about that. So hopefully people got that. I'm going to hand over to Alistair to speak for a few minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A. So over to you, Alistair.
Thanks, Kate. So good afternoon, everyone. I think in terms of kind of the flexible furlough scheme and in terms of how it's affected my world, it's really not an awful lot has changed. I think what was promising for myself and certainly the clients I deal with is that the information we got from the Treasury last week actually confirmed what our expectations were, which does help, and we've started that planning now. I think like most businesses at the moment, we are looking forward in terms of how we deploy this and how we get the best outcome, to make sure that we're still here in 12, 18 months time, 2 years. And really kind of we're looking at things in 2 phases. One is kind of how you stay liquid initially as a business until you understand where your business are. And then you can get into that long-term planning in terms of kind of how we work long-term. And unfortunately, there's no crystal ball. And actually many businesses don't know what's going to happen because we're coming out of this into the new normal over a phased period. But I think what the flexible furlough scheme does, it actually allows us to give a sense of cost and actually to then plan forward, because we know we'll need certain things during those initial periods. And I think the big thing for any employer now is to start to look at this and say, right, we've got the flexible furlough scheme, we know the rules of the game, we know these aren't going to change over these coming months. So how do you want to use this? And actually, it's an aid there to actually say that as work comes in, you can turn certain skills up in your business and turn certain skills down, and you can attempt to manage your cost base on that basis. So you can essentially have a bench which you can deploy and substitute people in and substitute people out as long as they're qualified in the right way. And this will hopefully kind of, if you get your planning right and you think about how you budget this and how you work with it, will actually really help in the long term. I think one of the things that I've seen in the last week, and I've not seen it directly, but one of my associates has, is actually if you deferred your PAYE payments and you've used the furlough scheme for the employees that are you're claiming on for furlough, HMRC are coming back for those payments for the employees that have been the PAYE payments for those furloughed employees. So I think whenever you move forward is to keep that in mind in part of your budgeting, because I don't think anyone wants any nasty surprises over the next coming months, because I feel that everything will be quite lean. So in that point, we're moving forward, we can start to plan, but I think it's having that flexible plan as well, because we've got a flexible solution. And after everything feeling kind of very definite before, I think this is a great way to kind of move forward. So it's how we then get into that cell. You know, people's lives there's no magic switch. People's lives aren't going to come back to the same way they are. And we've got to look at, one, how that workplace works moving forward. Also, when we start to speak to employees and get the agreements to come back on either a flexible furlough or deciding who comes back on a flex basis or who stays furloughed, it is taking into consideration those social factors, because schools still aren't reopening. We've still got caring issues that go on with that, and people have to potentially care for disabled and vulnerable people. So if we try and force people back, there's risks of claims for discrimination during an indirect basis, and it's trying to get that skills match as best as possible. I think the fear is that people will still think quite linearly and say that actually they'll try and put a square peg into a round hole, and actually it doesn't facilitate the right outcome for the business. And I think within that, it's recognizing that you'll probably have three types of employee over the short term, which you've got those that are staying in the business that are working full time, or maybe taking a pay cut within the business, have been there long term. You have those that have maintained a status of furlough and are fully furloughed as we go through that. And then you've got the flexible furloughed team. And that may interchange, but I think this is all new for everyone. And actually there's a huge amount in terms of, to make this work, the process is simple, but a huge part of this is about the communication. Because in terms of, from what we've seen, is if we thought about when the furlough scheme first came in, we thought we'd be into selection matrices, and actually people wouldn't be willing to do that. In fact, we had the opposite issue. It was oversubscribed. People were willing to go into furlough. But in some respects, the reaction has been quite different, because as we've seen in the press, some people feel that they've been ostracised, and there's a poor view of people that are furloughing because actually they're at home. People think they're watching Netflix and having an enjoyable time, where actually people are at home and they are worried about their jobs. And there's a huge element of this where I think we've been so busy dealing with the crisis that we've not thought about the people that actually may need to come back in and to operate our business moving forward, and how you get that engagement. You know, and this for us really comes about how you drive that communication for everyone in the business, because a person might be working full time now, who've previously been furloughed, who may move on to a flex furlough, and you'll need that person to sign up to the agreement. And actually, this is where the creating a narrative, having a strong narrative so they understand what's going on, and then buying into that narrative to make sure that actually it delivers what needs to happen. So this for me is kind of, how do we do that? And the communication is a big part of this. So we need to help people understand the why. You know, what is the plan? But I think there's a fear that actually you don't want to tell people the plan, and actually you don't want to tell people the wrong thing. In reality, this is there to help people, allow people to have flex, and you can flex that plan. And I think be clear in terms of if there's certain triggers within your business that's happening that will then allow you to then deploy certain scenarios. So if there's certain volumes of work that come in, you can then start to bring people back from furlough. Or if there's certain levels of activity, these teams will be deployed as part of the flexible furlough scheme, or we'll need to turn down these teams. So people have a sense of what's going on, but also work with people in terms of trying to find inventive solutions around some of the challenges. So if people are concerned about their salary, if you've got people that are working, say, 50% of their working week, can you top up part of that flexible furlough scheme with things like annual leave? And it then negates an issue for being able to having that outstanding annual leave there, and they've agreed to that, and that can then work forward. And I think there shouldn't be a fear of being too honest in terms of this whole point, and it's making sure that you have that plan, you understand where they are, people can understand where the gates are and the checks are, and people understand where the check-ins are as well in this, because I think there's a huge part of where the trick we've missed in all of this is actually not having the communication element of this. I've seen some businesses do it fabulously well, and I've seen some businesses do it poorly, because ultimately we've all tried to lean into the Dunkirk spirit, and actually in truth that hasn't happened in the way that it would do. We've seen a phenomenal amount of claims from business against businesses where SMEs have asked employees to go on furlough, and the employees have then gone back and essentially they've reported to their employers because of the fact they've been asked to work full time, they're hiding things. And actually this is potentially an area of risk for businesses, because I can certainly see that if you have an employee that is working on the flexible furlough scheme, and so that person works full time Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, you may ask that person to work, say 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And it's how do you control that person between 1 p.m. and 5 p.m. So how do you make sure that they're not going home doing emails, or they feel there's an obligation from the business to go home and do emails, to do additional bits of work, but only claim for the hours that they're in the office. And with that, I think there's a conversation, to Andrew's point before, in terms of controlling the hours, and you can only make that claim at the end of the month, because you need to have control mechanisms in place to make sure that you are keeping on top of this, that managers aren't taking advantage of the system, and actually not then liable for claims from employees about the business doing the wrong thing. And actually, I think that whole abuse piece is quite interesting. I think with all of this, where we've had gaps, statutory processes still apply. And I feel as employers still think that we can play the COVID card in this. And actually it means that we can do anything that we wish because it's COVID. I think for me, it's important that COVID is a starting point for this. This should bring us together to help employees understand, but it's not an excuse for the behaviour. What we need to do is use that as a starting point to then deliver then our action plan and to use that. So the big thing for me is budget, understand what you need, try and get that roadmap through in terms of what you need to do, and then think about those optional plans in terms of how you may then deploy that with the various triggers, and then think about your comms to go with that.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Right, I'm going to go into questions now. I'm going to try and group, quite a lot of them are quite similar, so I'm going to attempt to group them. So the first topic to come up is around the need to agree a set pattern of work, or how flexible you can be, and then how you get agreement for that. So somebody's saying, I was proposing saying work to be provided when and if required. Somebody else has asked, could we say we need 15 hours a week, but you can choose when you work? Andrew, can I ask you any advice on getting the agreement? Do you need to get an agreement every week if it's different, or can you set something quite vague?
I think it's more capable of being an agreement the more certain it is. But clearly, employers need flexibility and won't always know in advance what their requirements might be day to day, let alone week to week. So I think for those people who are planning some kind of a flexible approach, provide as much certainty as you can. So for example, it might say something like, we anticipate at this stage a pattern of 2 days on, 3 days off, or 2 out of 5 days to be worked, but we'll notify you of the days each week. Provide as much certainty now as you can, and then obviously provide the detail later. If you're too vague and say we'll just call you as and when, I think that's barely capable of being regarded as an agreement, because it's the employees don't know what they're agreeing to. So I think you need to provide some information about the pattern you expect people to follow, but it's fine to fill in detail as you go. And of course, what you will need to do retrospectively is confirm precisely how many hours people have worked as against their furloughed hours when you're making the claim.
Alistair, anything to add on that?
No, I think Andrew's covered it off. I think to my point is that I think you can have like gauge of what goes up of your plan, but in terms of what happens in reality, so I think so many things are changeable. You need that kind of start with a plan and then true it up at the end of that kind of reference period, the individuals as well.
And can staff choose the times that they work? So you could say, we need you for 15 hours it's going to be 15 hours a week, but you decide when you work. I mean, I guess the issue for that, Alistair, would be how you maintain control and transparency.
Yeah, I think it's different things for different employers. Some people can have that flexibility because I think if you can do it, that's better. But I think that for certain businesses, you have a time schedule and you need certain people to be in the business at certain times. And you do have that right to say, kind of, yeah, be there because we need you. We need those boots on the ground. And if it's not you, then we'll need to get someone else.
How do you actually record the hours? Somebody's asked, is a letter enough, or do you need to have to ask submission of hours worked? Do you keep it on, record it on your payroll system? Andrew, what do you think you'll need to keep? I think
as far as the agreement with the employee goes up front, I think it's fine to agree verbally, even as long as you record that agreement then in writing and write to the employee and keep that written record of the agreement for 5 years. As regards making a claim, I envisage that the claim system will evolve and you will record hours on the system itself. And then I think any type of written record that you are able to retain for that 6-year period will be sufficient. I mean, I'm not a payroll expert. I'm not familiar with the mechanics of payroll management, but any permanent record that records furloughed hours as against working hours, I think will be fine.
So somebody suggested using timesheets on there as well.
Yeah, that sounds to me like it would be absolutely fine to do.
Great. Got some questions. This is one submitted in advance about usual hours. So they've given the example of their operatives working a standard 39-hour week, but also having discretionary overtime when required. So is the usual hours the 39 hours, or if you usually do 5-10 hours overtime over a month, what is usual hours, Andrew?
I would say if it's truly discretionary stroke voluntary overtime, then you would exclude overtime for the purposes of recording usual hours. But if somebody is obliged to do overtime or it's a regular fixture for them, then that will probably feed into a variable hours calculation instead. So as with the calculation of holiday pay, it's a question of deciding what overtime is genuinely discretionary, and you would exclude that as opposed to that overtime which is expected or really part of the working pattern, which you would probably include.
Yeah. We do actually, you mentioned holidays. I've had a few questions on holidays. How should employers manage holidays? The temptation will be for holiday days to be furlough days. Is this allowed as long as pay is topped up to 100% on those days? Alistair, any thoughts?
I think to go back to the point I made before is that you can ask people to take annual leave during that furlough period, period of furlough. I think certainly when you get into flexible furlough, and if people are feeling the pinch, it's the trying to encourage people to maybe use as the points they're not being deployed. So if you're furloughed for 2 days,
you just froze there. So can I just ask you to rewind? So was that use the annual leave for the days that you're?
No, that is fine. Sorry. Yeah, it's using, say, if you're furloughed for 2 days in a week or a couple of weeks, it's maybe use some annual leave to top up that 80% to 100%. And actually, you've then not got that annual leave carrying over, and you've not got that big backlog on that basis. But I also think it's encouraging people still to allocate leave as they go through the year, because I think in this situation, people have not done that. So they should still be taking those breaks.
Have you got any updates on holiday, Andrew?
Well, just to say, we spoke about perhaps a flexible furlough pattern of Monday, Tuesday in work, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday furloughed. I think if somebody wanted a Monday off, it would come out of their working hours. if somebody wanted a Friday off, it come out of their furloughed hours. Obviously, nothing to say you cannot take holiday during a furlough period, whether that be flexible furlough or old style furlough. Obviously, subject to you paying 100% though. Even if you're only reclaiming 80% for the furlough period, you must pay holiday at 100%.
Yeah. This is one that was submitted in advance around what is classed as working. So could a furloughed manager be involved in discussions from home about making the place of work COVID safe, or is that actually work? They want to make sure that they're playing by the rules. Anyone, Alistair?
I think from my point of view, the way that question's framed, it sounds like they are going to lead discussions and they're essentially going to drive the risk assessment of the work environment. From my point of view, that's providing a service to the business. So you'd need to be at work to do that, and you won't be able to be furloughed and do that. I think if you're informing an employee about what the requirements are to return to work and how to work safely, you can do that while someone's on furlough, or you can go through that consultation while someone's on furlough. But if you're driving and you're influencing and you are creating that policy, then they've really got to be at work, in my opinion.
Do you agree with that, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. As Alistair says there, an employee expecting to return to work and has the right to be consulted on safety measures taken in the workplace. So if they're just taking part in that process, that wouldn't be work for me. But the manager driving that process, as Alistair says, is providing a service to the business, and therefore you would think that is work, and they cannot do that whilst furloughed.
Ben, can I just bring you in here from a public policy point of view? Obviously, there was a report earlier this week about businesses breaking the rules around furlough. How strict do you think kind of audit and things are going to be, and what sense do you have that people are breaking the rules around it and that it really is widespread?
It's very difficult to tell from the sort of anecdotal evidence. I mean, I think probably what would be useful in terms of making sure that doesn't happen would be HMRC taking some action and showing that that they are expecting employers to comply, and I think doing some spot checks and some and then communicating where they are taking action against employers, I think would be quite useful, and just make sure that that the parameters of the scheme are respected, and that employers are using the scheme as it is intended, and using the flexibility as it comes on stream in the right way as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So I've just lost the question that I was going to ask. We've had a few around redundancies. So one pre-question was around if redundancies are identified and the consultation and notice period is being undertaken, do we need to pay full notice pay, or can we pay at 80% or 2,500 for those who remain on furlough during the consultation? And I'm just going to, if Andrew, you could take that, and I'm going to find the other one about redundancy.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think when it comes to calculating statutory redundancy pay, you are definitely talking about calculating on the basis of normal salary, that is pre-furlough salary. Notice pay is a bit more complicated. I don't think the position is really settled on it. But the best we can say at the moment is that if somebody when dismissed, is only entitled to stat notice, so that's for example 4 weeks after 4 years service. If that's their maximum entitlement, then you have to pay the notice period at 100%. Although if they're on furlough, obviously nothing to say you can't reclaim 80% back whilst they're furloughed. The situation is a bit different for somebody who has a contractual entitlement to notice that exceeds their statutory notice. So for example, the same person with 4 years service, suppose they're entitled under the contract to 3 months notice of dismissal. If they spend that 3 months on furlough, you would say that if they've agreed a reduction to 80% during furlough, that would continue throughout the notice period in a way that it wouldn't if they were only entitled to statutory notice. So that's the position. It's a distinction between those entitled to enhanced notice rights as opposed to those to entitled to stat notice only. The other important thing to mention is that it's common in redundancy situations to pay in lieu of notice. Don't expect to pay in lieu of notice and recover anything under the scheme, because the scheme is designed to cover wage costs. And arguably paying in lieu is not essentially paying a wage, it's paying in lieu of a wage. So if you pay in lieu, don't expect to recover anything at all under the scheme. But if you are allowing people to work out their notice, in inverted commas, because obviously they won't be working if they're furloughed, but if they're seeing that period out, then you can reclaim under the scheme, but what the employer is entitled to receive depends on their notice rights.
And building on the redundancy issue, has there been any guidance around whether you need to bring people back from furlough for consultation and notice period, Alistair? And if they are remaining on furlough and you're doing it all virtually, do you have any advice about doing it in the best way?
I think in terms of the advice and guidance I've seen is that in going through the actual consultation, you're able to undertake that, certainly with employee representatives, and that won't affect their furlough status. I think in terms of, you've seen the guidance from ACAS has actually been updated recently in respect of how you deal with grievances, disciplinaries, but I think it's that you've got to find that way of engagement. And I think going back to my point of communication is that it's the early engagement. I would be comfortable doing it through Zoom and through online tools to make sure that people understand. But I think you've got to over communicate, and you've got to make sure that people understand that and give people the tools then to go back to their members or the people they're representing to make sure they can then effectively communicate that back out. I think the normal rules aren't there as it stands at this moment in time, and we've got to think differently and behave differently.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions about whether there's been any updates on shielding employees. Somebody said in theory they can be invited back to work on the 1st of July. Will there be an extension to the shielding period? And someone else has asked whether you can insist people return to work because they're providing an essential service if you've done a risk assessment and deem it safe to return for those who are shielding. Andrew, any update on that?
As regards shielding, I did see a headline that those shielded are expecting an update from the government very, very soon. I think it's imminent that they will be reviewing that and sending further communications out. I think in terms of requiring people to return to work, as always, follow the government guidance. And at the moment, the guidance is that those shielding should definitely be staying at home. Those with other pre-existing health conditions are advised to maintain social distancing where possible. And the guidance, as far as I know, still is that if you can work at home, you should. So keep all of those things in mind. As and when it comes to people returning to work, some will be nervous. And I think it's important to listen to those concerns and try to work with employees to ease them back to work. Many of those pre-existing conditions we were talking about there would amount to disabilities for the purpose of the Equality Act. So there's an immediate duty on employers to consider reasonable adjustments in those circumstances. So consider allowing people to work at home, consider staggered hours, consider changing the work environment. Do what you reasonably can to meet those employee concerns, because it could lead to issues later if you don't.
Thank you. If we don't wish to return people flexibly or make use of this kind of new scheme, do you still need to send a new agreement for this new period from July to October, or does the agreement that you did whenever, kind of March, April, May, still hold?
I would say it depends on how that agreement is worded, because I've seen some that are time limited. But if it's an open-ended agreement and it covers the current situation, I don't think you need to do anything further. It's fine to leave people on old-style furlough for as long as you need to, and that original agreement, assuming it's an open-ended agreement, will cover that situation.
Alistair, have you got any advice on how the FFS is applied to casual workers who've been furloughed? So somebody's saying, I'm worried if we bring them back, that effectively ends their furlough due to the nature of 0 hours. for example, a casual worker who effectively worked 35 hours a week on average, furloughed based on that. Now, if they come back for only 7 hours a week, how do we apply the scheme?
That's a very good question. I think if they've been working on the, and Andrew may correct me on some of this because that's a very technical question. If they've been working the 35 hours and that's been their normal and that's their average, they can work on that basis, or that's the calculation we can use. One would assume that you can then apply a flexible furlough status to that person on that basis. If you've got those 35 hours in the bank and that's the right calculation you can use. And if you can deploy them for 7 hours, then use them for those 7 hours and then use the flexible furlough scheme for the rest of those hours.
I'll ask Andrew to also expand.
Yeah,
on that.
I mean,
put you on the spot.
Just on that, I mean, I think it was always open to somebody to argue that, you know, if this was a genuinely 0 hours arrangement, then if we have no work for you for whatever reason, we're not required to give you any. I'm always a bit nervous about that because a lot of these arrangements that appear to be worker stroke 0 hour arrangements had some element of neutrality about them, and there was an expectation that people would do work when offered. So often these arrangements did slide into something resembling employment with an expectation on both sides that work would be provided and undertaken. Having said all that, the scheme clearly said that those on those kinds of arrangements could be furloughed. And so I've seen nothing at all to say flexible furlough will be any different. So you would use that variable hours calculation. Look at what somebody did in the previous year or in the previous calendar period, last tax year, and treat that calculation as producing an indication of their normal hours. And then whatever they're not working now would be treated as a furlough arrangement rather than working. But I think the answer is yes, you can carry on furloughing those people in that way.
Thank you. Just to flag, I know a few people are asking about whether we have a template for a flexible furlough letter, and just ask my colleagues and say HR Inform does have one, so you should be able to find that. Alistair, I think this is kind of more of an engagement and a communication question, really. So how would you advise you to deal with staff that might not wish to come back and work flexibly on a part-time scheme because actually they'll not financially be any better off or much better off?
I think from my point of view is that we've got to look at it's a broad issue, and I think it's how much of an impact is that person being flexibly furloughed going to be affected. You would hope that if they come back and they're furloughed currently, actually to come back and work flexibly, you would be in a better position with that, and then you maybe look at alternatives in terms of topping up with some annual leave during that process, during that period. If they were to remain furloughed, they would be 80% of 100%, which actually would be less than actually on a flexible basis. And I think a lot of it is actually to come back and just engage and have the conversation on a one-on-one basis. But it's enabling, if you can ask the managers to have that conversation, it's equipping them with the information so they can actually answer those questions in the same breath. So if the fear is about how will I actually be receiving more money as a consequence of coming back and going on flexible furlough, I think ultimately you will be, because there isn't a situation where you aren't better off because you'll be receiving some additional hours at full time, or some of those hours at full time rate.
Any advice there, Andrew? How to deal with
No,
that?
I don't think I'm going to add anything to that, really. I mean, on the broader issue of engagement, I mean, I think I've thought about that issue in the context of return to work and anxieties around health, and that's something we've covered in previous presentations, and also touched on it in my last answer. So people are going to be nervous about coming back to work. So engage with them as early as you can and deal with their individual concerns.
Yeah. This is a really quick one, Andrew. Just can you clarify? Oh, I just lost it. Oh, there it is. I know you said this in the presentation, but just to clarify again, where the guidance says that the number of employees an employer can claim for in a claim period cannot exceed the maximum number, is that maximum referring to the number of employees, the maximum hours, or the maximum money?
Number of employees. Yeah. So if you previously only ever claimed for 30 employees or less on a single claim, that's the maximum number of employees you can claim for going forward on a single claim.
Thank you. Ben, this is something we were discussing pre-going live, but if there's a second peak, what do we anticipate to happen kind of in the autumn once the scheme finishes?
Yeah, I mean, I think there would be quite a lot of pressure on government to possibly restart the job retention scheme in some form. It's interesting that in France they announced, I think last week, that the French job retention scheme is being extended and into a ongoing short-time working scheme, a bit like the German scheme. And the German scheme is a sort of semi-permanent part of their labour market, so which the government uses to try and support employment during times of economic shock. So, I mean, I think there is a real rationale to use the job retention scheme in the future to address these sort of waves, if we do get a second wave, to keep people in employment, because this is not like a normal recession. In theory, the economic demand should pick up fairly quickly after, as a pandemic reduces. So so I think it's a long answer, but I think there could well be pressure for some form of job retention scheme to happen in the future, but really difficult to tell. Government has really made a case that it's going to the end of October is the end of the job retention scheme, but I think certainly question marks about whether that the scheme could JRS2 could happen again if we have a second wave.
And are we expecting there to be further intervention? I know that there's going to be some stuff coming out in July, but will that focus on a different aspect, do you think?
Well, yeah, it's been flagged that there's going to be some form of emergency budget week beginning 6th of July. We don't know for certain if that's the sort of the date, but I think we're certainly expecting some announcements around skills policy, for example, around supporting young people into apprenticeships, other measures to increase investment in skills and lifelong learning. I think there's going to be a real focus on how do we help people who do lose their jobs to reskill or retrain so that they can get back into the labour market as soon as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to bring it to a close there, I'm afraid. I tried to answer a lot of questions. I'm sorry I haven't got through all of them. I think that hopefully in Andrew and Alistair's presentation, if you watch back, I think some of the detail was covered in that, and you will be able to download the slides. And I'd also point you in the direction of the CIPD. We've done updated the guidance around furlough. We've also got some new FAQs I think were updated kind of earlier this week, and my colleague has put those in the chat, so you'll be able to access it that way. Thank you very much, Alistair, Andrew and Ben, for joining us this afternoon. The webinar and the slides should be available hopefully from this afternoon. If not this afternoon, then early next week. And you can sign up for future webinars via the CIPD website. And actually, you might be interested, some of you, in coming along on Tuesday, because we've got a special session where we've got experts from HMRC, and they're going to be covering advice on the furlough scheme, on the flexible furlough scheme, but also on statutory sick pay. And that's going to be particularly for interest for those in smaller organisations, so organisations of less than 250 people. So the details about that are on the website, but we will have two experts from HMRC who will be able to answer your questions. And I think for that we'll be able to take some pretty detailed and specific ones that I wasn't able to take today. And then just to flag that from Wednesday, we're going to be beginning a new series of webinars about tackling racism in the workplace. And a final reminder about our new wellbeing helpline for members in the UK and Ireland, which hopefully you can see, yes, you can see details about on your screen now. But that's it from us this afternoon. So thank you all very much for watching. Thank you for your questions, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.